Before we introduce any more of the material, let's talk a little bit about environmental due diligence, what it is, and what it entails. We'll focus on the Phase 1 environmental site assessment, which is the cornerstone of the environmental due diligence industry. But know that there are many other types of due diligence out there, some of which is more intensive and some of which is less intensive than the Phase 1. Here's an example of a typical Phase 1 report. Major sections of the report would include an interview section, a site visit section, a database review section, and a historical review of the property. The goal of the Phase 1 is to identify recognized environmental conditions, which are commonly known as RECs. It's called a Phase 1 because it's the first step in what may be many steps of investigating a property. As an example, in Phase 2, someone might drill on the property, taking soil and groundwater samples to understand contamination, and in later phases, it may further characterize the site and potentially remediate the property. The clients for a Phase 1 report may include someone lending on a property or someone buying a property with the idea that they want to know the risks associated with being affiliated with that property. Environmental due diligence is ordered right alongside other products such as appraisals and title searches. And the typical length of a Phase 1 project is about 21 days. As previously mentioned, here are some of the components of environmental due diligence that would be included in a Phase 1 report. Let's cover them in more detail. A fundamental part of most any environmental due diligence is the database report. This would typically be one of the first things you ordered and looked at. Database reports show the subject property centered on a map and all of the sites of concern around it. This would include sites where there are permits or known releases of contaminants. An example would be a leaking underground storage tank or lust that you might find at a gas station. Included in the report is typically a table that shows all the databases that were searched, the distance to which they were searched, and whether or not any sites, including the subject property, are listed. The purpose of the site visit is to examine the property for any evidence of environmental contamination, both past and present. In this slide, you see vent pipes, which are indicative of underground storage tanks. Here we see staining associated with the storage of these containers. It may or may not be determined at the end of the project that this is a recognized environmental condition. Here is a bulging, unlabeled drum with potentially some staining below. Here are some PCB ballasts that are being stored in a drum. PCBs might be found in transformers, hydraulic lifts, or light ballasts. Here we have some fill material that appears to have been brought in from another source. The assessor would want to find out, to the best of their knowledge, what the source was and whether or not the soil represents a REC. Know that these are just some of the selected examples of what an assessor would look at during the site visit. While at the property, you also want to assess the adjoining properties and surrounding areas to help both characterize the site and identify potential concerns. Interviews are a valuable part of the process. While you are at the property, you will likely want to talk to current owners, managers, tenants, neighbors, and other people that may have valuable information. During this process, it is important to understand that some information may be confidential and that the interviewee may not readily offer accurate information. During the historical review portion of the project, you'll be tracing property use back in time to see if there is cause for concern. This may be one of the more challenging but informative parts of the project. Here, this seemingly innocuous property, currently part of a bed and breakfast, was actually a gas station back in the 40s and 50s. It is hoped that this would be discovered through the historical review process. To identify historical property use, an assessor will typically utilize a number of sources of information. One of the more informative and frequently used sources is fire insurance maps, like this one from the Sanborn Company. Information of past use and the presence of tanks can be seen on these maps, among other things. Here we see a garage and auto body works, which may lead us to the conclusion that there is a REC. Other sources would include historical aerial photos, historical topographic maps, and old city directories, which are sort of like reverse phone books in that you are able to look up addresses instead of phone numbers. During the environmental due diligence process, you may also go to a number of other places to get information. You may go to the town or city hall where you would visit the assessor's office or the building department. You may go to the fire department to get information about past fires or registered tanks. You may go to the Department of Environmental Quality or the Department of Environmental Protection at the county or state level in the case where they may have records on the subject or adjoining properties. There are a number of other things that may or not be included in the Phase 1. Collectively, these are grouped as non-scope items. The type of property, the age of the property, and the client will all determine whether or not these would be included. While not a complete list, here are some examples. Lead-based paint, asbestos, radon, and mold. Here are just a few additional takeaways. Environmental due diligence is fast-paced in that rarely will a project be longer than 1 month, and some projects will last less than a week. The work is dynamic, meaning that due to scheduling, scoping, and deadlines, things can change very quickly. To be good at environmental due diligence, you need to be somewhat of a detective, and you need to persevere to get the information. And for some firms, you may travel a lot. I hope you've seen through this that the work can be both interesting and rewarding. While what we've covered is not an inclusive list, it should give you some idea of what environmental due diligence is all about. A closing note. Even if you're great at fact-finding and great at analyzing the data, if you don't put it on paper in a concise and readable way, the information will be lost. So remember to write well. If you'd like more information about environmental due diligence or property due diligence in general, please visit commonground.edrnet.com.